They lost because they neither valued nor respected all of the extraordinary blessings of liberty. The freedom to surprise, to make mistakes, to invent, to build.
Have you heard J.D. Vance's powerful speech in Europe? It was more than just another diplomatic address. It was a wake-up call to a continent on the brink of losing its foundational values. Vance didn't just talk about Europe's shift away from its Christian biblical principles. He warned that without these values, Europe could lose the very freedoms it holds dear, including freedom of speech, religion, and the right to express differing opinions. As Vance argues, Europe's post-Wabidi reconstruction was built on democratic ideals rooted in Christianity. But now, a rising tide of secularism threatens to undermine those ideals. As younger generations drift away from these traditions, Europe may be on the verge of a dangerous slide into authoritarianism. It's not just about values fading into the background. It's about the very framework that guarantees freedom, democracy, and self-determination unraveling. This isn't just a debate. It's a critical question for Europe's future. What happens when the values that protect our freedom begin to erode? If this topic piques your interest, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join us for more deep dives into the issues that matter most. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The headlines following Vance's speech reflect the deep divide his words sparked across Europe. The Daily Telegraph boldly declared, "Vance, free speech in Britain is in retreat." This was no exaggeration. In recent years, Britain has faced significant challenges to free speech, as government regulations on online content have increased, and speech deemed offensive is being increasingly censored. From the policing of hate speech to the rise of cancel culture, these developments have led many to question whether the UK still values free speech as it once did. In The Times, Vance's comment, "Vance tells Europe to clean up its own mess," made waves because it seemed like a direct indictment of European leaders' inability to address the erosion of core values. His message was clear. Europe cannot rely on America to fix the internal problems it is now facing. This sentiment ties into a broader issue within Western political discourse. Europe, often seen as a liberal beacon, now faces a growing concern over its ability to protect democratic values from its own internal political dynamics. Then there's The Guardian, which responded with the headline, "Vance launches blistering attack on Europe's leaders." While this characterization seems somewhat dramatic, it highlights an important point. The European leadership, especially within the EU, has been slow to respond to issues like the erosion of free speech and religious freedoms. In countries like France, where secularism has long been a pillar of national identity, there is growing tension between secular policies and the rights of religious minorities. Vance's critique brings these tensions into the open. Public opinion, naturally, is split. Some praise Vance for his bluntness, applauding him for telling Europe things that many are uncomfortable confronting. Others, however, view his speech as an affront to European ideals and see it as a foreigner overstepping into their domestic affairs. The responses reflect a deeper rift between what Europe wants to believe about itself and the reality of what's happening within its borders. Vance's critique goes beyond just pointing out flaws in Europe's values. He draws attention to a broader geopolitical shift. For decades, Europe has enjoyed the security and stability provided by the United States. The US has been Europe's military backbone, its defense partner in NATO, and its financial safety net. However, Vance argues that this arrangement can no longer continue without a serious rethinking of Europe's responsibilities. As the world grows more complex, especially with growing threats from within, it's clear that Europe must step up. The Trump administration's approach to Europe was marked by a push for greater European self-sufficiency. Under Trump, the US increasingly called for NATO members to fulfill their defense commitments, putting pressure on Europe to take more responsibility for its own security. Vance's argument builds on this framework, stating that Europe cannot depend on external forces to preserve its internal freedom. He asserts that Europe must confront its internal problems, such as cultural divisions, political polarization, and a growing distance from its Christian heritage, before it can focus on external threats. This mirrors what we saw in the US during the Cold War. The US was invested in Europe's defense, not only because of its geopolitical importance, but also because European stability was seen as integral to global peace. But today, as Europe faces internal divisions, whether over immigration, economic inequality, or identity politics, the stability of its political system is increasingly called into question. The real threat now is not just from external forces, but from within. As Vance puts it, Europe must clean up its own mess, and this means dealing with these internal threats head-on. One of the most alarming aspects of Vance's speech was his focus on the increasing crackdown on Christian values across Europe. He pointed out that European governments have passed laws that directly impact Christian practices, whether it's the inability to express certain beliefs openly, restrictions on religious symbols, or the criminalization of actions seen as offensive to certain groups. The most striking example comes from Sweden, where a Christian activist was convicted for burning a Quran in protest. While the act was controversial and certainly provocative, it raised serious questions about the extent to which free speech and religious expression are under threat in Europe. For Vance, this case epitomizes a disturbing trend: censorship and punishment disguised as protecting social harmony or defending democracy. What's happening in Sweden, he argues, is not the defense of a free society, but the beginning of the kind of authoritarianism that has historically been associated with regimes that seek to suppress dissent. He also pointed to the European Union's increasing power over social media platforms, with threats to shut down accounts or remove content deemed offensive. Whether it's hate speech laws in the UK or similar regulations in Germany and France, there is a growing push to limit free speech in the name of protecting society from perceived harm. But Vance's warning is clear. When governments begin controlling speech, even under the guise of protecting democracy, it's a slippery slope to authoritarianism. Censorship becomes normalized, and once that happens, freedoms are harder to reclaim. Moreover, the UK's police raids on anti-feminist posts serve as a disturbing example of how laws designed to protect people can actually stifle freedom of expression. While those in power may argue these measures protect vulnerable groups, Vance argues that they risk undermining the very democratic values they claim to defend. The case of Adam Smith Connor's arrest for silently praying near an abortion clinic in the UK has stirred up fierce debate. Connor's quiet personal prayer was deemed a violation of the Buffer Zones Law, a regulation designed to prevent protests near abortion clinics. The law was originally intended to keep protests from becoming disruptive or harassing to those seeking medical services, but it is increasingly being used to restrict basic expressions of faith. In this case, the criminalization of silent prayer shows just how far things have gone in the UK when it comes to suppressing religious expression. This incident is part of a broader, growing trend of restricting religious freedoms under the guise of protecting others from offensive behavior. Consider the UK's broader efforts to legislate speech and thought. The hate speech laws and government actions to crack down on so-called offensive material have increasingly blurred the lines between protecting citizens and impinging on basic freedoms. Laws like these have faced criticism for being overly broad and subjective, often overreaching into the realm of personal belief. In this case, Connor's peaceful act of prayer in a public space becomes not just a violation of a law, but an example of how government intervention into private, personal acts of faith can be interpreted as excessive overreach. It's important to remember that these laws are often touted as protecting the vulnerable, but they can easily be manipulated to silence voices of faith, especially when such acts occur in spaces where there is no harm being caused to anyone. The situation in Scotland amplifies concerns around government intrusion into private religious life. Scottish authorities sending letters to individuals warning them against engaging in private prayer at home in safe access zones takes this issue to a new and disturbing level. These safe access zones were originally designed to keep protests or disruptions from abortion clinics, but the government's warning extends far beyond public spaces. Now, even personal, private prayer is under surveillance, raising questions about where we draw the line between protecting public order and intruding on the sanctity of private life. This idea of thought crime may seem extreme, but it's becoming more of a reality in Europe. While the Orwellian term thought crime refers to the criminalization of ideas or thoughts without any action, in this case, the fear is that the government is starting to regulate what people can think and believe, especially in the private sphere. The very concept of state intervention in private religious expression poses a direct challenge to fundamental civil liberties. It's not just about what individuals are allowed to do in public, it's about what they are allowed to think and pray about in their own homes. This represents a major shift in Europe's approach to free speech and religious freedoms, shifting from protecting individual liberties to seeking control over private thought and expression. Vance's speech raises a fundamental question that Europe must confront. What values is it really defending when it actively suppresses the right to practice religion freely? European leaders claim to uphold democracy and individual freedoms, yet policies restricting religious expression are becoming more common. The question becomes even more pressing when one considers that Europe's secularism is increasingly at odds with the very freedoms it purports to protect. This contradiction has led some to suggest that Europe's leadership is pursuing an agenda that isn't truly about protecting freedom, but about consolidating power. Vance alludes to this with his critique of a growing global elite agenda that pushes for greater centralization of power under the guise of global unity and progress. This global governance agenda, often associated with the European Union and similar international institutions, could lead to the erosion of national sovereignty and individual rights. It echoes historical moments when governance structures sought to limit the freedoms of individuals in favor of larger, centralized systems of control. The European Union, in particular, has been criticized for its increasing influence over national policies, and it's here that the comparison to the past becomes especially relevant. For instance, during the Soviet era, similar tactics of imposing conformity on member states stifled dissent and suppressed individual liberties in favor of state control. The rise of the EU's influence has been praised by some as a symbol of unity and cooperation, but it is increasingly seen by critics like Vance as a step toward an undemocratic global governance structure. The rise of centralized control under the EU, coupled with increasing censorship of speech and thought, poses significant risks to the fundamental freedoms that Europe has long been known for. The battle for freedom is one of the central themes in Vance's speech. He compares Europe's current trajectory to the methods used by totalitarian regimes, particularly during the Soviet era. In the USSR, free expression was systematically shut down through censorship, surveillance, and punishment. The state sought to control every aspect of individuals' lives, from their speech to their private beliefs. Today, Vance argues, we are seeing similar trends in Europe, where free speech and religious expression are increasingly under attack by government forces. This comparison to Soviet-era tactics is not an exaggeration. Governments in some European countries have begun to monitor and censor social media platforms, forcing private citizens to walk on eggshells when it comes to expressing opinions that might be deemed politically incorrect. Countries like the UK, Germany, and France have all passed laws targeting speech, whether it's related to religion, gender, or politics. These laws, framed as protections against hate speech or extremism, have been used to suppress individuals or groups who express dissenting opinions, much like the state-driven censorship in the Soviet Union. For example, the UK's Online Safety Bill, which mandates the regulation of social media platforms, has raised concerns about freedom of speech. This law grants the government extensive powers to regulate online content and remove material that could be seen as harmful or offensive. Critics argue that such laws are overly broad and threaten to silence those who challenge prevailing narratives. Vance's argument is that when censorship becomes widespread, it leads to the gradual erosion of the freedoms that made Europe a beacon of liberty and democracy. Vance also tackles the controversial issue of migration, highlighting the overwhelming levels of immigration into Europe. The migration crisis has become one of the most contentious issues in European politics, with a dramatic increase in the number of migrants and asylum seekers entering the continent. In some European countries, such as Germany, immigrants now make up a significant portion of the population, with 1 in 5 residents being foreign-born. This has raised concerns about the impact of immigration on national culture, social services, and security. Vance stresses that Europe must adopt a more balanced approach to migration, one that embraces compassion but also emphasizes the importance of responsibility and justice. While Europe has long been seen as a haven for refugees and migrants, unchecked immigration can strain social services, fuel economic inequality, and increase tensions between different cultural and religious groups. A striking example of the consequences of poorly managed migration is the car ramming attack in Munich, carried out by an asylum seeker. This tragic incident underscores the dangers of failing to properly vet and integrate migrants into society. While the vast majority of migrants come in search of safety and opportunity, a small minority has engaged in violent acts that raise security concerns. Vance argues that this isn't about opposing immigration. It's about ensuring that migration policies prioritize both compassion and national security. The challenge for Europe is finding a way to reconcile its humanitarian goals with the practical realities of migration. In recent years, Europe has struggled to develop policies that balance the need for security with the desire to maintain an open-door policy for those in need. Vance's call is for a more responsible, pragmatic approach, one that ensures that Europe remains a place of refuge for those truly in need, while also protecting the interests of its own citizens. The reaction of European elites to J.D. Vance's speech was dismissive at best, with many intellectuals, politicians, and media figures ridiculing his concerns. For them, Vance's warnings about the erosion of religious freedom, free speech, and the rise of government censorship were seen as alarmist and overblown. The elites largely argued that these issues were exaggerated or irrelevant in the context of the real problems facing Europe, such as economic crises, migration challenges, or geopolitical instability. This dismissive response reflects a broader trend within political and cultural circles, particularly in Western Europe, where traditional values, including religious faith, are increasingly disregarded as outdated or incompatible with modern, progressive ideals. This attitude isn't unique to Vance. Over the years, similar critiques have been levied against populist movements and their leaders, such as Viktor Orban in Hungary or Marine Le Pen in France, who have highlighted the growing disillusionment of ordinary citizens with elites in Brussels. These leaders have been vilified for their criticism of the EU's policies. particularly on issues such as immigration, secularism, and national sovereignty. What is particularly telling about the elite response to Vance's speech is the way it mirrors the broader tendency to disregard or belittle concerns about religious freedoms and free expression, as if these rights are secondary to economic or social progress. By dismissing Vance's concerns, European elites fail to understand that the foundation of any society, its very freedom, rests on the ability of its citizens to express beliefs and practice religion without fear of persecution. While the elites dismiss Vance's message, the reaction from the public in Europe has been markedly different. Social media platforms, particularly Twitter and Facebook, have been filled with citizens discussing his words, with many expressing support for his critique of Europe's growing secularism and the rise of government censorship. A significant portion of Europeans, especially those from more religious or conservative backgrounds, are finding resonance in Vance's warnings about the erosion of their liberties. This public engagement mirrors the social dynamics seen in recent populist movements across Europe, such as the Yellow Vest protests in France, which erupted in 2018 in response to rising fuel taxes but expanded into broader dissatisfaction with the political elite. Just as those protests were fueled by a feeling that the elites were out of touch with the needs of everyday people, Vance's message resonates with those who feel that their cultural and religious concerns are being ignored. In countries like Poland and Hungary, where national identity is still closely tied to Christianity, Vance's warnings about the erosion of traditional values are viewed as both timely and urgent. These populations see themselves as the guardians of Europe's cultural and religious legacy, and Vance's critique validates their fears about what Europe's future holds if current trends continue. However, the disconnect between the political elite and the public is perhaps most glaring in the response to the Brexit referendum. The failure of European leaders to take the concerns of the British public seriously in the years leading up to the Brexit vote contributed to the dramatic decision to leave the European Union. The political elite's failure to listen to the people, particularly in terms of concerns about sovereignty, immigration, and the erosion of national identity, ultimately led to a political earthquake that reshaped the landscape of Europe. The same pattern is playing out now with the issues Vance raises, where the elite's disregard for the concerns of the broader populace could lead to deeper dissatisfaction and further political upheaval. For Christians, Vance's speech goes beyond a political critique. It serves as a clarion call to stand firm in the face of mounting secular pressure. Christians are called to resist the darkness and stand for righteousness, even as the world increasingly moves away from faith-based values. In many parts of Europe, Christian institutions are facing not only a loss of influence, but outright hostility from governments that view traditional religious teachings as antiquated or divisive. The UK's buffer zones law that criminalized silent prayer near abortion clinics is just one example of how laws, initially aimed at preventing harassment, are increasingly being used to suppress religious expression. The challenge for Christians today is not just political, but spiritual. As Europe becomes more secular, Christians are faced with a world where their beliefs are increasingly marginalized. In many ways, this mirrors historical periods when faith and religious expression were suppressed by authoritarian regimes. The comparison to Soviet-era tactics is not coincidental, as totalitarian governments throughout history have understood the power of religious belief to challenge state authority. Whether through the suppression of the church in Soviet Russia or the repression of religious freedoms in modern-day Europe, the common thread is the state's desire to control all aspects of life, including personal belief. Scripture offers guidance in times of challenge and oppression. 2 Timothy 1:7 reminds Christians that they are not given a spirit of fear, but one of power, love, and a sound mind. This verse challenges Christians to boldly stand for the truth, even when it's unpopular or risky. In the context of Europe's current trajectory, it's a call to actively defend religious freedom, resist the pressure to conform to secular norms, and continue to share the gospel despite government opposition. In this sense, Christians are not merely passive recipients of the culture around them, but active participants in shaping it through their resistance to injustice and their commitment to faith. Europe is at a crossroads. J.D. Vance's speech is a call to wake up to the growing threats to freedom that are becoming increasingly evident across the continent. Whether it's the suppression of religious expression, the rise of government censorship, or the erosion of the values that have shaped European culture, the stakes are high. Vance's message is clear. Europe cannot continue to ignore the concerns of its citizens, particularly when it comes to the erosion of their most basic freedoms. Christians have a critical role to play in this fight for freedom. By standing firm in their faith, resisting the forces that seek to suppress religious expression, and speaking out for the rights of all individuals to practice their beliefs freely, they can help to preserve the values that Europe has long held dear. It is not enough to remain passive as these freedoms are stripped away. Christians must take action to ensure that future generations can continue to live in a Europe that values the principles of liberty, democracy, and religious freedom. Vance's challenge to Europe is a timely reminder of what is at stake, and the time to act is now.